Imagine being wronged beyond measure, betrayed, hurt, and cast aside. What if I told you that in the deepest pain, there's a secret power that can change everything? A power so profound that it doesn't just heal your wounds, but transforms your entire life. This is the story of how one act of forgiveness from the most innocent man to ever walk the earth can offer a path to true freedom. Let me take you back to a moment in history where the life of Jesus Christ holds the key to a transformation we all crave. Once upon a time in a dusty village in ancient Judea, there was a man who was like no other. Jesus Christ, born in humble surroundings, grew up to become a beacon of hope for the lost, the broken, and the oppressed. His message was simple yet profound. Love one another, forgive as you wish to be forgiven, and live as if your neighbor's pain is your own. One day, as Jesus walked through the streets of Jerusalem, he encountered a situation that would forever change the way we see forgiveness. A woman, trembling with fear, was dragged before him by a group of religious leaders. They accused her of committing the act of adultery, a crime punishable by death under the law. The crowd was ready to stone her, their anger boiling over as they shouted condemnation. The woman was terrified, knowing that her life was about to end. She was guilty. She had no defense, no argument. And yet in that moment, when all eyes were on her, something remarkable happened. Jesus bent down and began writing in the sand with his finger, as if he had not heard the accusations. The crowd grew impatient, pressing him for an answer. Finally, Jesus stood up and said words that would echo through history. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." A silence fell over the crowd. The message was clear. No one was without fault. One by one, the accusers dropped their stones and walked away, until only the woman remained, standing before Jesus, trembling but still alive. Jesus looked at her with compassion and said, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She answered, "Oh, no one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." In that moment, the woman's life was not only spared, but transformed. She had been given the gift of forgiveness, not because she deserved it, but because Jesus chose to forgive her. This act of mercy was a reflection of a much greater truth, that forgiveness is the key to unlocking our own freedom, our own peace. But this was only the beginning of the lesson Jesus had for us. You see, the power of forgiveness doesn't just change the lives of those who are forgiven, it changes the hearts of those who choose to forgive. Jesus went on to teach his followers about the importance of forgiveness. He shared parables about a servant who owed a great debt, one so large that he could never repay it. When the king forgave him, the servant went on to refuse forgiveness to another who owed him a fraction of the amount. The king, upon hearing this, was furious and cast the unforgiving servant into prison. The lesson was clear. To receive forgiveness is a blessing, but to withhold it is to imprison your own soul. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning the wrong done to us. It doesn't mean forgetting the pain or pretending it never happened. But it means releasing the weight of bitterness and anger that we carry and choosing to let go of the need for vengeance. It means trusting in a higher power to bring justice in his time while we focus on healing and moving forward. And this is the ultimate lesson Jesus taught us through his life and death. As he was nailed to the cross, surrounded by mockers and enemies, he looked up to heaven and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In his moment of greatest suffering, he chose to forgive those who were responsible for his pain, offering them grace instead of judgment. This act of divine forgiveness was not just for those who stood at the foot of the cross. It was for all of humanity. It was an invitation for us to lay down our burdens of anger, guilt, and resentment, and to pick up the freedom that only forgiveness can bring. Now let me pause here for a moment. Take a deep breath and think about your own life. Is there someone you need to forgive? Is there a wound you've been holding on to? A grudge that's been eating away at your peace? Jesus' message is clear. Forgiveness is not just a gift to others, it is a gift to yourself. When you forgive, you break the chains that bind you to the past and step into a future filled with peace, joy, and freedom. So what's holding you back from embracing the power of forgiveness? The same Jesus who forgave the woman caught in adultery, who forgave his enemies on the cross, is offering you that same grace today. Will you accept it? Will you allow forgiveness to change your heart and in turn, change your life? Let this story be the turning point in your journey. No, Maddie. Number two, now let's take a step deeper into this message. As we think about forgiveness, we must also remember that it is not always easy. It's not just a one-time decision. It's a choice we have to make over and over again, especially when the hurt feels too great to overcome. The question then becomes, how do we forgive when it feels impossible? How do we embrace the power of forgiveness when we are in so much pain? Jesus gives us the answer through his life. He didn't forgive because it was easy. He forgave because he knew that there was something greater than the pain, something that could transform hearts and lives in a way that vengeance and anger never could. Jesus knew that true forgiveness isn't just about letting go of the past. It's about embracing the future with a heart full of love and hope. It's about choosing to believe that, no matter what, there is a plan for your life that's bigger than the hurt. There is a future waiting for you that can't be defined by the wounds of your past. When we forgive, we are choosing to live in freedom. Freedom from bitterness, freedom from hatred, freedom from the cycle of pain and revenge that traps us in a never-ending struggle. It is as if forgiveness opens a door to a new reality, one where love reigns instead of resentment. But there's another layer to this truth. Forgiveness is also about healing. The more we forgive, the more we allow ourselves to heal. Holding on to unforgiveness is like holding a wound open, never allowing it to close. Every time we remember the hurt, every time we replay the past in our minds, we reopen the wound. But forgiveness is the balm that begins the healing process. It doesn't erase the hurt, but it allows the healing to begin. Jesus knew this better than anyone. He didn't just forgive because he was perfect. He forgave because he understood that forgiveness was the only way to bring true peace. And he also knew that forgiveness was not a one-way street. It was the key to unlocking peace not only for the person being forgiven, but also for the one offering forgiveness. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus taught us to pray, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." This simple but powerful line shows us that forgiveness is not just about us receiving it, but about us extending it. It's a cycle. We receive forgiveness and we offer forgiveness. And in this cycle, our lives are transformed. Take a moment to reflect on this. How many times have you felt burdened by your own mistakes? How many times have you wished for someone to forgive you? If forgiveness is so essential in our own lives, shouldn't we be quick to extend it to others? Let me tell you another story. A story of a man who learned the true power of forgiveness in the most unexpected way. There was a man named Stephen. He was a faithful follower of Jesus, spreading the message of love and forgiveness wherever he went. But one day as he was preaching, he was arrested by a mob who accused him of blasphemy. They dragged him out of the city and began stoning him, a brutal and unforgiving act. As the stones rained down on Stephen, he could have reacted in anger. He could have cursed his attackers or asked for revenge. But instead, in his final moments, Stephen looked up to the sky and prayed, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." In that moment, Stephen chose to forgive, even in the face of death. He chose to follow the example of Jesus, embracing the power of forgiveness even when his own life was at risk. And in that act of grace, he found peace, a peace that went beyond understanding. This story of Stephen teaches us that forgiveness is not just an act of mercy toward others, it is an act of trust in God's justice. When we forgive, we are trusting that God will take care of the wrongs done to us. We are trusting that he will bring healing to the wounds, that he will restore what was lost, and that he will use our forgiveness to bring about something greater than we could ever imagine. So what does this all mean for you? How can you begin to embrace the power of forgiveness in your own life? The first step is to recognize that forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing the wrongs done to you. It's about choosing to release the burden of resentment and bitterness that has held you captive. It's about making the decision to no longer let the actions of others control your peace. Start by acknowledging the pain. It's okay to feel hurt, to feel anger, to feel sadness, but don't let those emotions take over. Acknowledge them and then choose to release them. Next, remember that forgiveness is a gift, both for the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven. It's not always about the other person's actions. It's about your heart. When you forgive, you allow yourself to move forward, to live in freedom, and to experience the peace that comes from letting go of the past. And finally, remember that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation always happens immediately. Sometimes it takes time to heal. Sometimes relationships need space to rebuild. But forgiveness opens the door for that healing to begin. Let this message sink into your heart. Jesus Christ didn't just forgive others to show us how to live. He forgave so that we could find true peace, joy, and freedom in our own lives. The power of forgiveness is the power to break free from the chains of the past and to step into the future God has planned for you. Will you choose to forgive today? Will you embrace the power of grace and mercy? The choice is yours. If you want to continue with more insights or dive deeper into the steps of forgiveness, just let me know. As we continue to reflect on the power of forgiveness, it's important to recognize that it's not a one-time decision. It's a daily commitment. Jesus didn't forgive once and then stop. His life was a continuous example of mercy, grace, and love, even when the circumstances were most challenging. Each day he chose to forgive, to heal, and to offer peace, even when it would have been easier to harbor anger or bitterness. This daily choice to forgive can sometimes feel overwhelming. How many times have we been wronged, betrayed, or hurt by people we love or trust? And yet Jesus' example shows us that forgiveness doesn't depend on how many times we are wronged, but on how many times we are willing to choose peace over pain, healing over hatred, and love over resentment. One of the most powerful teachings of Jesus on forgiveness comes when he speaks to his disciples about how often they should forgive. Peter, one of his closest followers, asks, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Peter thought he was being generous, but Jesus replied, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times." Matthew 18:21-22. This was not about a literal number of times to forgive. It was about an attitude, a willingness to forgive without limit. In God's kingdom, forgiveness isn't bound by numbers. It's bound by grace. Jesus wanted his followers to understand that forgiveness should be as natural as breathing, constant, unconditional, and without end. Now let's pause and think about this. What if we approach forgiveness in this way? What if we didn't keep track of how many times someone wronged us, but instead kept track of how many times we chose to forgive them? What if, rather than counting the offenses, we counted the opportunities to extend grace? What kind of freedom would that bring into our lives? One of the most powerful aspects of forgiveness is its ability to heal not just the person being forgiven, but the one offering forgiveness as well. When we hold on to anger, resentment, or unforgiveness, it's like carrying a heavy load that weighs down our soul. This load might not be visible to others, but it affects everything we do. It clouds our thoughts, taints our relationships, and robs us of peace. But when we forgive, it's as if we are setting ourselves free. We are letting go of that burden and choosing to live in the light of grace. Forgiveness is like the act of opening a window in a dark room and letting the sunlight flood in. It doesn't change the past, but it changes the present moment, and in that moment, we find peace. The Bible tells us that if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. John 8:36. This freedom doesn't just come from being forgiven, it comes from forgiving others. Jesus offers us freedom from the chains of bitterness and anger. He shows us that when we forgive, we break free from the control that our past has over us. We no longer allow the wrongs done to us to define our future. But how do we step into this freedom? How do we move from knowing we should forgive to actually forgiving? The first step is to pray for the strength to forgive. Jesus never asked us to do anything without equipping us for it. In the Lord's Prayer, when we ask God to forgive us as we forgive others, we are also asking for the strength to forgive. Forgiveness is not always easy, but when we ask God for help, He will empower us to do what seems impossible. The second step is to release the other person to God. Forgiveness doesn't mean you have to fix the other person or change them. It means trusting that God sees the situation and will handle it according to His justice and mercy. When we forgive, we are handing the matter over to God, trusting that He will bring about the healing and restoration that is needed. And finally, remember that forgiveness is a journey. Sometimes the hurt doesn't go away immediately, And you may need to forgive the same person multiple times. But each time you choose to forgive, you are taking a step toward freedom. And each time, you are choosing to become more like Christ, more loving, more compassionate, and more at peace. There was once a man named Saul who was a fierce persecutor of Christians. He spent his days hunting down those who followed Jesus, imprisoning them, and even approving of their deaths. He was driven by anger, by a sense of justice according to his own understanding. But one day, while traveling on the road to Damascus, he encountered Jesus in a way that changed everything. A light from heaven shone down, and Jesus spoke to him, saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" In that moment, Saul was blinded. He realized that he had been wrong, that his actions had been based on misunderstanding and hatred. He was then led into the city, where a disciple named Ananias, following God's command, went to him, laid hands on him, and prayed for him. Saul's sight was restored, and he was filled with the Holy Spirit. Saul, who later became known as Paul, went on to become one of the greatest missionaries the world has ever known. His life was completely transformed. The man who once persecuted Christians became a powerful voice of forgiveness, preaching about God's grace and the power of redemption. This story shows us that no one is beyond the reach of forgiveness. No matter how far we've strayed or how much we've hurt others, God's grace is greater. He can take the most broken life and transform it into something beautiful. As we reflect on this, ask yourself, what has unforgiveness been costing you in your own life? Is there something that's been holding you back from experiencing the peace and freedom that comes with letting go of past hurts? Jesus is offering you that peace today. Forgiveness is a choice. It's a choice to let go of the past, to stop letting the pain of others dictate your happiness, and to trust in God's ability to heal and restore. When we choose forgiveness, we are not only changing our own hearts, we are changing the world around us. Now take a moment to ask yourself, who do I need to forgive? What hurt am I holding on to that I need to release? The power of forgiveness is available to you right now. Choose to embrace it. Choose to live in the freedom that comes from forgiving and being forgiven. As we continue on this journey of forgiveness, let's remember that it's not just a one-time decision, but an ongoing process. Every day we are given opportunities to forgive, to let go of old hurts, to offer grace, and to make the choice to be free from the chains of anger and bitterness. In the book of Ephesians, Paul writes, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." Ephesians 4:32. This is the standard by which we are called to live. The reason we forgive is because God first forgave us. He forgave us when we didn't deserve it. He loved us when we were still far from Him. His grace was extended to us not because of anything we did, but simply because of His mercy. Now, as those who have received such incredible mercy, we are called to extend that mercy to others. We are called to forgive, not because it's easy, but because it is through forgiveness that we become more like Christ. We grow in love, humility, and compassion. We learn to see others through the eyes of grace, understanding that we too are flawed and in need of mercy. There's a story of a man named Corrie ten Boom, a woman who survived the horrors of a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. After the war, she became a powerful speaker and writer, sharing her testimony of God's faithfulness and forgiveness. One day, as she was speaking in a church in Germany, a man came up to her after the service. He was a former Nazi soldier who had been responsible for many of the atrocities she had witnessed in the camp. He stood before her, asking for her forgiveness for what he had done. In that moment, Corrie's heart was torn. She knew what he had done. She had lost family members in those camps. She had experienced the horror of the war firsthand. How could she forgive this man who had caused so much pain? But as she stood there, she remembered the words of Jesus, "Forgive, and you will be forgiven." She prayed for strength, and with trembling hands, she extended her hand to him. And in that moment, something miraculous happened. As she took his hand, she felt the love of Christ flow through her. Love that was greater than the hatred, the pain, and the betrayal. Corrie later shared that forgiving the man did not erase the pain, but it allowed her to be free from the bitterness that threatened to consume her. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the man's actions. It was about releasing her own heart from the grip of unforgiveness. This story shows us that forgiveness is often a choice we have to make, even when it feels impossible. But when we make that choice, we open ourselves to a deeper healing, a deeper peace, and a deeper relationship with God. The truth is, when we forgive, we don't just release the other person from the debt they owe us, we also release ourselves. Unforgiveness is like a prison that holds us captive. It keeps us locked in a cycle of pain and resentment, robbing us of peace, joy, and the abundant life that God has promised us. Jesus spoke about this in the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18:21-35. In the story, a servant owes a great debt to his master, one that he cannot repay. But when he pleads for mercy, the master forgives him the entire debt. However, when the servant goes out and encounters a fellow servant who owes him a much smaller debt, he refuses to forgive and has him thrown into prison. When the master hears about this, he is enraged and says to the unforgiving servant, "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" The master then hands him over to be tortured until he can repay the debt. Jesus ends the parable by saying, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." This parable is a sobering reminder of the seriousness of forgiveness. God has forgiven us a debt we could never repay. The forgiveness we receive is immeasurable, and in light of that, we are called to forgive others. When we refuse to forgive, we are only keeping ourselves in bondage, trapped by the same unforgiveness we refuse to release. In the same way that God forgives us, we are called to forgive others. This is the essence of the gospel. The good news that no matter how far we've fallen, no matter how much we've sinned, God is willing to forgive us. And as we receive this forgiveness, we are called to extend it to others. The choice to forgive isn't always easy, and it's not always fair in the eyes of the world. But in the kingdom of God, forgiveness is the key to healing, peace, and restoration. It is the pathway to true freedom. As we come to a close on this message of forgiveness, I want to encourage you to take a moment of reflection. Is there someone you need to forgive today? Is there a burden you've been carrying, maybe for years, that you can release? God is ready and willing to give you the strength to forgive, just as He has forgiven you. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It doesn't take away the hurt or the consequences of the wrongs done to you, but it does change the way you live today. It opens the door to healing, to peace, and to freedom. It allows you to move forward in your life, not held back by the weight of anger, bitterness, or unforgiveness. Remember this: forgiveness is not a gift you give to the other person. It's a gift you give to yourself. It's the gift of peace, the gift of freedom, and the gift of love. When you choose to forgive, you are embracing the transformative power of God's grace. You are choosing to live a life that reflects the love of Christ in a world that desperately needs it. So I invite you to take that step today. Release the burden of unforgiveness. Choose to live in the freedom that Christ offers. And know that as you do, you are becoming more like Him, more loving, more compassionate,